Marcus, and this is my first talk, so I'm probably going to screw it up, and I hope that's all okay with you. Like I said, I'm Tom, and I come from a little studio called Inkle in the UK. There's three of us, and I wasn't actually part of the original release, but we famously released 80 days on iOS and PC. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tragedy in video games, whether it's possible for a video game to be a tragedy in the same way that Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy for theatre. And are there already tragic games that already exist? And how can we develop our own tragic games? Why would you want to? What's the advantage? So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about what tragedy actually is. So when we think about tragedy, we kind of think of horrible explosions and oil spills and dead whales, and we say oh, that's a tragic event, it's horrible, horrible things. But that's actually not what a tragedy is at all. A tragedy is a plot. It's a very specific plot. It's a plot that involves a flawed protagonist. And they have something wrong with them a little bit, and they set in motion a terrible chain of events, and that normally leads to a lot of suffering. And at one point in the plot, normally about halfway through, the protagonist realizes the horrible things they've done, and they normally die horribly. So this is sort of what a tragedy looks like in graph form. So things get a bit more exciting, then the protagonist has something horrible happen to them, and they realize that they're horrible people, and then it's all downhill from there, and this is where they die horribly. So most tragedies revolve pretty heavily around this tragic hero. Like all the tragedies you can probably think of, like Romeo and Juliet is the obvious example. They have a tragic hero, and that character is pretty well defined. So a tragic hero is always a highborn person, like they're sort of kings or princes, warriors, something that allows them to have a massive impact on the world, that makes the tragedy more tragic. They're never entirely good or evil, so it's important we relate to them and that we don't think that they're gods or that they're just demons. Like, they have to be relatable people. They have to have this tragic flaw, which is sort of crux to what a tragedy is. And this flaw has to make them do something terrible. The flaw is really important in a tragedy. And like I said, halfway through, they normally realize that the flaw made them do something horrible, and they become aware of what they've done. And then something really bad happens to them, probably something way worse than they actually deserved. So why would people be interested in tragedy? It sounds horrible, like it's just depressing. So nobody really knows this, but lots of people have sort of discussed it, and the general consensus is that we like tragedy because it makes us pity somebody. And then when we see how the plot ends, it sort of releases all of these negative emotions in us. It's like a breath of fresh air. It's like if something really bad happens to you and you have a good cry, you're going to feel better after that cry. And that's sort of what a tragedy does. It releases these horrible emotions in us, in the same way that an action film will make us feel really good at the end. Tragedy does this, but in another way, through negativity rather than positivity. So Romeo and Juliet is kind of the classic tragedy, so I'm just going to run you through the plot of Romeo and Juliet, and we're going to see how it sort of ticks all the boxes. So Romeo is a highborn noble in Verona. He's mostly a pretty good guy, but we see that he's a bit violent, he's a bit arrogant, but he's pretty cool. But at one point, those traits lead him to kill somebody, and 2 other people die. Like, it's a pretty bad situation. So he's banished, and then at the end of the play, his lover Juliet and him both die in this tragic circumstances. So we can see that it's kind of hits all the boxes off. It's like a sort of archetypal tragedy. So what's interesting about tragedy is that we don't really use it anymore. Like, the IMDb page for Romeo and Juliet doesn't describe it as a tragedy. It's sort of a term that's fallen out of use, which is kind of strange, because it used to be, like, along with comedy, one of the 2 genres, and we don't really discuss it anymore. But the great thing about that is, because nobody really says, oh yeah, that's a classic tragedy, they say, oh, it's a drama or a war movie, or like a disaster movie. It means that if you say your game's a tragedy, we're trying to develop a tragic game, nobody's going to call you out on it. It means that we can take this genre and we can make it our own in game form. So what's a tragic game? What does that look like? Like, you might have already realized, like, I don't want to play a game that makes me lose and is going to kill me. There are quite a few problems with it. So I'm going to walk you through a few examples of games that are already tragedies, in my opinion. Whether they are is up to you, there's no official consensus on this. So Shadow of Colossus is kind of one of the better examples of a tragedy. At the start of the plot, we're introduced to the main character, and he takes with him his, I don't know if any of you have played it, I kind of hope you will have. He takes with him his dead girlfriend or wife, and it's clear that he's unable to get over her death, and there's this great loss that he suffered. And that's his flaw. His flaw is that he's unable to get over this girl's death, and that causes him to enter this forbidden land where he's tasked with killing these mighty colossi along the land. And it's kind of hinted at that he might not be doing a great thing by doing this, and he becomes slowly cursed. And then at the end of the plot, he becomes possessed, and he ends up killing members of his old tribe and then dies. So you can see that it kind of follows the same plot as Romeo and Juliet, and it follows all of the steps. So one of the interesting things about tragedy is that it forces us to detach ourselves from the character. So in most games, when we win, we feel happy, our character also wins, like Mario gets to the end of the level, he's all happy, we're all happy, and if he dies, we're going to be unhappy because we just lost. But in a tragedy, we beat the level, and then the character dies. So as you can see here, these guys are really happy that our protagonist is having his eyes gouged out. So it's kind of an interesting paradox. So how does Shadow of the Colossus do this? In Shadow of the Colossus, the tragedy isn't really about you. The tragedy is about our character. He's the one with the tragic flaw. He's the one that suffers. But what's interesting about the game is that we're the one that puts him through it. We make him kill the Colossi. So we instigate the events of the plot, and then he suffers for it. And what's interesting about that is it kind of casts us into the role of the villain. We're kind of making the plot happen. We're making all these horrible things happen to this guy, even though we kind of suspect that it might not be for his best interests. So if the player is the tragic hero, which I think is the sort of holy grail of a tragedy, which Shadow of the Colossus doesn't do, we kind of are faced with a couple of problems that I think I mentioned earlier. Like, you can't kill the player at the end of the plot, so you can't have this tragic ending where the player themselves is the subject of the tragedy. And as well as this, players are all different. You're going to really struggle to find a tragic flaw in our player, just because most players are different. You can't assume that every player is going to be angry or prideful. So a game that tackles this really well is a game called Spec Ops: The Line, which again, I hope you all play because it's wonderful. So Spec Ops: The Line kind of has a similar plot to Shadow of the Colossus and Romeo and Juliet. It's a similar thing. It's about our hero who enters a war zone, and his flaw is that he really wants to be a hero. He wants to do good. He wants to save the people in this town. And very early on, he gets caught up in all of this warfare, and his desire to do good leads him to do these terrible things. And at the midpoint of the plot, he accidentally drops a bomb on a refugee camp and kills a lot of people. And he's in total denial about it because he's just trying to be a good guy. And the game keeps making you try to feel bad for what you're doing. You keep killing people, but they fired first, so it's okay, right? And like, the game's going to give me a happy ending. It's going to tell me that everything's going to be fine. So what's interesting about this game is that just as our protagonist is struggling with the idea that they might not be a hero anymore, you also are struggling with the idea that you're playing this game because you want to have this power fantasy, you want to be a hero. But the game's denying it. Every single time you finish a level, the game says, you just killed like 50 people. Are you sure that's okay? And it makes you feel bad for that. So this is really cool. I think this is a really, really great example of a tragedy that involves the player. I think it's wonderful. But there's an interesting dilemma here, is that you're kind of making the player feel bad. And in most games, we want the player to feel good. Like, games are meant to be fun, right? Like, that's the point. But you're kind of asking the player to pay £40 for a game, and then by following the game's instructions, we tell them that they're bad people. Like, that sounds pretty sucky. And I can see why a lot of people would get quite angry about that. I don't have an answer for this. This is like, I don't have answers for most of this stuff. Nobody has solved these problems. So I'm actually going to leave a lot of these questions with you. And these are the two games I think are possibly the best examples of video game tragedy in its sort of standard form. So I'm going to quickly run over a few games that have elements of tragicness, but they're not tragedies. They're games that make you think about yourself. They're games with sad endings, but they're not actually tragedies. And what's interesting about them, just in reflection, is how they can form a base for a tragedy, and they might be interesting in reflection if you are interested in developing your own tragic game. So the first of these is a game called Train, which was designed by Brenda Braithwaite. And in Train, it's a board game where you have to get these little yellow tokens, these little people, into the cars. And you're told that each of these people represents, I think it's 100,000 people, and you're trying to cram them into the cars, and then when you do that, the car gets sent along the track, and you just have to complete as many cars as possible. And then when you beat the game, you get all of your cars down the end of the line, you turn over one of these train cards, and then the game says, Auschwitz. That's all it says, it just says Auschwitz. And you're like, oh, I see what I was doing. And you're sending all of these people to their deaths in the Holocaust. And it's really, really heavy. Like, this is not a very nice game, and apparently a lot of people who played it were either incredibly angry that somebody would make this game, they felt nothing because they felt they'd just been tricked, that's not cool, you can't do that, I'm not even relate. Or they broke down in tears because it's kind of horrible. So what's interesting about this is it's actually not a tragedy. Like, you might think, oh, that's sad, that's tragic. Like, I did this, and you might have all of these inner turmoils having played this game. But it isn't a tragedy. Like, you don't really, nobody dies at the end. Well, you don't die at the end. Like, it's a tragedy for all these people, but who's the tragic hero? I guess it's not you, it's probably not them. There's no, like, single person. There's, like, no uphill point where you are doing all these things and then you realize what you've done. Like, it's sort of only debatably a tragedy. So another one is Papers, Please, where you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. I'm kind of going to assume that a lot of you have already played this one. So every day you have to let people or deny them access into the country. But sometimes people will come to you and say, look, I really need to get into the country. Like, I'll die if I don't get in. And you might think, oh, well, maybe I'll just let this one guy in. But then you're penalized. A bit of money is taken away from you. So by trying to be a good person, the game is just making it incredibly hard for you to be a good person, to be the person you want to be in this game. And you might think, so that's really tragic, especially when your family members start dying because you couldn't afford the heating in this country because you kept letting people through the border. But again, it's not really tragic. Like, there's not always a sad ending to the game. Like, sometimes it's just a bit, ooh, and it's kind of unclear what the tragic realization is or what your tragic flaw is, except for just trying to be a nice guy. So again, maybe it's not a tragedy. I don't know. Your call. Another one is Bioshock, which again, I'm kind of going to assume you guys have already played. So Bioshock is arguably a tragedy that's not really about you. You kind of play just like an explorer, like just dotting around the city, and the plot's already happened. But Andrew Ryan, if you've played the game, again, I'm hoping you have, he's kind of a tragic hero in that he kind of tried to found this city where anything could happen, where great men could come and do all the things they wanted, unbound from petty morality, as he says. But it all collapsed in on him. So he had this vision, and he had this tragic flaw, which is that he didn't realize that this could come back in on him, that allowing people to be totally free could cripple him. And then it did. But the thing is, he's not really the protagonist in the game. He's just a guy you kill, and you hear about his story. So is that a tragedy? I don't know. And lastly, there's a game called One Chance. I think it's a wonderful example of how a game resolves one of the main problems with tragedy, is that if you die in a game, and that would normally be the end of a tragedy, you'll take that as, like, I'm just going to play again. Like, I screwed that bit up. I'm just going to do it again. I'm going to load my save, and I'm going to go for the good ending, right? Because nobody wants to end their game with everybody dying. So what One Chance does that's really clever is it's a game where you're told that you have 6 days to save the world. And the world is also ending. So depending on your choices that you make during the game, you can either spend them with your family, or you can just go out and party loads, or you can try to save the world. Or you could just do a mixture of all of these things. And there's a bunch of endings, and the game progresses in different ways depending on what you do. I'll tell you now, if you do actually manage to save the world, I think your wife and daughter both die horribly, thinking that you've abandoned them, and if you spend your time with your wife and family, I think they still commit suicide, and it's just, all the endings are horrible. But what's really cool about this game is that when you restart the page, the game just relaunches you back where you were. You can't ever replay. You can't ever know if you could have changed things. So your actions are permanent. They are yours. You're stuck with them. And this is a really interesting way of constructing maybe a tragedy. But again, it's not really a tragedy, it's just tragic. It just contains all of these tragic things, these horrible things. And it's got a cool idea. So that's actually it for my talk. I literally don't have any answers for you. I just wanted to present an interesting problem and show you how a few games have tackled it and how a few games have wrestled with the idea of making games that aren't all fun and games. They're not all the way about winning. So I hope that was enlightening. And I hope that you guys managed to come up with some tragic games, because I have failed so far. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? All right. That makes my job way easier. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. Oh, sorry.
I realized I did last week or something, there was a Norwegian championship of game design, and I realized we did a tragedy. Because you play as a scientist that is high up and developing cloning, but every time you clone yourself, his sanity goes down.
Right.
And the player doesn't know everything that happens. You just know that if I clone myself, I get full life again. So you go up, and when the player realizes, you realize also you can never go back.
That's really good.
Like one chance.
That's awesome.
An infinite spiral of madness.
Yeah, and you're right, that's actually a tragedy, because you realize that your tragic flaw is that you're trying to push forward all this stuff, you're trying to get somewhere.
Yeah.
And you don't realize it, and as soon as you realize it, it's like, oh my god, what have I done?
Yeah,
and then there's this moment of suffering.
You shrunk, and there were 4 different levels with 4 variants of music, design and everything, so you don't see that you go through the same 4 levels again and again and again.
Oh,
and the more
cool.
you commit to cloning, you fuck yourself really badly.
Alright, I'm going to replay that one afterwards.
It's not that awesome, you made it in only 1 week.
Alright.
The idea is there.
Cool. Alright, well, anybody else got any questions? No? Alright, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.